is this the wheels of justice turning, or is this a political stitch-up?
When you said wheels of justice turning, I was thinking you were going to say wheels of justice falling off the wagon. This is the most remarkable thing for anybody who is a lawyer in the United States.
The Newsagents USA.
It's John.
It's Emily.
And the history of the relationship between James Comey and Donald Trump is long and it is fraught. Arguably, James Comey handed Donald Trump his election victory in 2016, when days before polling, he reopened an investigation into Hillary Clinton's use of a private email server. After the election, he makes Donald Trump aware of this dossier that alleges that Donald Trump was compromised by Russians and that there was an investigation by the security services looking at Russian interference in the election, which led to the Mueller report, which Donald Trump absolutely hated. Then, when Donald Trump becomes president, he says to Comey, "I want you to pledge your loyalty to me." And James Comey says, "No, I pledge my loyalty to the US Constitution, not you." And now, spool forward to today, and James Comey is on the stand as a criminal defendant for breaching kind of classified information.
Yeah.
And it looks like an utterly, excuse the metaphor, trumped up charge.
Yeah, a highly politicised accusation. Now, James Comey wrote in his memoirs in 2018 that Trump was morally unfit to be president. Again, big black mark against Comey by Donald Trump. I don't think he ever imagined a world in which Trump would get re-elected. Comey also told me that he lay awake at night thinking about Trump going after his political enemies. And sure enough, that has come to be. But until last week, no prosecutor, including Trump's second Attorney General in his first term, believed that they would actually get to the point of pursuing an indictment. They just thought this was Trump going off on one. We know Trump, takes it out on his enemies, perceived, imagined and real. Nobody actually thought there would be a prosecution based on the evidence at the time. But in the last few weeks, Trump replaced a federal prosecutor who said the case was too weak and put in his own stooge, a personal loyalist, Lindsay Halligan. Lindsay Halligan was willing to override professional judgment and call Comey to the stand. And we should just explain the context of this. The statute of limitations for the perceived crime would have run out just days before that indictment came. In other words, this was a last chance saloon. Trump has hated Comey. He wants to see him embarrassed, up on the stand, facing accusations of perjury, of whether or not he leaked a document. And that is how the prosecution is now unfolding. We're going to talk about this with somebody who knows the FBI really well and James Comey really well, Andrew Weissmann, who was the general counsel, i.e. the top lawyer of the Federal Bureau of Investigation.
Well, we're talking about Comey and the way that so much has been politicised, and we're joined now by Andrew Weissmann, who was the general counsel of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. So the lead lawyer, the kind of advisor on what can and cannot happen at the FBI, and has done all sorts of distinguished things since then.
Including as deputy to Robert Mueller over the Russia investigation, right?
I headed up one of the teams there. Yep, exactly.
So let's start with James Comey and the indictment. And is this the wheels of justice turning, or is this a political stitch-up?
When you said wheels of justice turning, I was thinking you were going to say wheels of justice falling off the wagon. This is the most remarkable thing for anybody who is a lawyer in the United States. So start with you're bringing a case against the former director of the FBI. Now, if he has done something wrong, there's no reason he shouldn't be prosecuted. There's no reason a former president shouldn't be prosecuted if they've done something wrong. But that is a grave, serious step. And you would think that you would have all of your ducks in a row and you'd have a very strong case. The procedural irregularities, which is a charitable way of phrasing it in terms of how the case was brought, I think, tell you volumes about what is going on in the United States. So it is widely reported that the career people in the United States Attorney's Office, that's the federal prosecutor's office, all said, no, this case should not be brought. It is too thin. But there's more than that. The United States Attorney, who was appointed by the president, so this is Donald Trump's person, who is in that office, also said no. So you now have the career people and the political
and the
appointees
loyalists,
saying no. And what happened to the loyalist? He was pushed out.
Yeah.
He has resigned. He says he resigned. The president says, I fired him. Doesn't really matter which it is. He's pushed out. And somebody who is a White House aide who specializes in insurance law, who has not done criminal cases, shows up as the interim U.S. attorney. And I'm an inveterate New Yorker, so I'll say within a New York minute, has the case in the grand jury to indict.
And they had to have it very quickly because the statute of limitations was about to run out on this whole case, right?
Exactly. So the statute of limitations is the amount of time that you have between the time of the crime or alleged crime, and in this case, it has to be done within 5 years. And you cannot be charged in the United States unless the grand jury votes an indictment. And so that's the process. So they had to go to the grand jury. The grand jury are just everyday citizens. It's 23 people. In order to have an indictment, you need to have 12 of the 23, so the bare majority. And the standard is very low. It is probable cause, which is, there's no set percentage, but think of it as about 20%. They proposed 3 charges to the grand jury. 1 was rejected. I want to make sure people understand. I tell people this in the United States as well. That just doesn't happen. You don't go to the grand jury unless you think you have proof and you can establish the case at trial, which is beyond a reasonable doubt. You wouldn't ever go with just probable cause, because what's the point? You're just going to lose later. And so just having that 1 charge not voted is a big deal. And then the other 2 charges were voted, but the count was 14-9. So what does it tell you that you couldn't get a unanimous grand jury at this low-level standard of probable cause, but the case at trial, when it goes to a jury, has to be proved unanimously beyond a reasonable doubt?
So there's a chance this will never even get to trial.
I
right?
think there are both legal reasons and there are reasons that a judge would not, after he hears the government's case, would say, I'm not letting it go to the jury, because no reasonable jury could find proof beyond a reasonable doubt.
But Andrew, explain this to me, because this seems... Donald Trump, then, is setting up to fail by everything you've described, that this is going to, if it ever got to trial, if it ever got before a jury, they are going to acquit, they're going to find James Comey not guilty, in which case doesn't Donald Trump look like a bit of a chump for having gone on and said he's a bad cop, he needs to be put in prison, he's a wrong 'un, all the rest of it?
You would think so. And what I would say is, in the rational world, that is absolutely correct, that this is something that could be a spectacular sort of belly flop, where you have the judge saying that this is an improper case, whether legally, or a jury saying this is a case that there's insufficient proof. And I think unless they come up with something that's a real rabbit out of a hat, this is going to end up in some form of acquittal or dismissal. But when that happens, we know from history with Donald Trump that he will just say it's either a corrupt judge or it's a corrupt jury, and he will just blame them, in the same way that when he was convicted in the Manhattan District Attorney's Office case, he said, well, you shouldn't trust. They got it wrong. The judge is biased against me. The jurors are biased against me. So that kind of distrust of the process will be his answer to that question.
I mean, Comey has a very strong case for saying this is a vindictive prosecution because Trump has said out loud what he thinks of Comey. He's called him corrupt. He's called him, wrong, criminal, all the rest of it. In other words, he's said this all out loud. Right. But I guess the question under consideration right now, specifically to this charge, is whether Comey perjured himself by saying that he did not leak information that he may have done. Now, is there a question? I mean, is there a question that he did leak information and he did lie about it?
So the reporting on that, let me back up and say, if the government was able to prove that, as somebody who was a defense lawyer for 10 years, a prosecutor for 20 years, if the former FBI director did that, I would be the first person to say that somebody in that position should be held to a higher standard, and this is an appropriate thing to be doing. And so it's a question of proof. Do they have the proof? Now, we've already talked about reasons why it looks like they don't, because you wouldn't have all these career people saying, I'm not going to go forward. I should add, by the way, that the case is actually going to be tried by prosecutors who are from another office, because none of the career people, it's been reported, are willing to do the case.
Because they think it lacks all credibility.
Right. I mean, I wouldn't do it if based on what we know. And so the issue is the charge here is that in 2020, when James Comey, during the pandemic, was at home but was testifying remotely from his home to Congress, was asked the question about whether he had authorized, essentially a cutout. He had authorized someone to leak information to the press. To make sure people understand, the director of the FBI is authorized to give information to the press. I mean, it's not really fair to call it a leak, because he can do that unless it was classified information or grand jury information, that it was protected in some other way. You have that authority. But be that as it may, that might go to motive. Like, why would he need to lie about this when he's authorized to do it? But he was asked that question. And in 2017, he had said, no, I didn't. But the statute of limitations ran on that 2017 testimony. So he has apparently re-asked that question in 2020. And James Comey says, by Ted Cruz, Senator Cruz from Texas, and he is asked about that. And James Comey says, I stand by my testimony. Now, just to be clear, and I'm going to be a little nerdy here, that is technically true. I mean, the statement, I stand by my testimony, could mean
that can't be perjury.
I am not changing my testimony.
Yeah.
You're not. What is not before any trial jury is the 2017 statement. It's just, I stand by it. Well, how is that ever going to be false? I mean, technically, I don't know how that is a false statement to just say, I stand by it. If he had actually said, and this will have to be the government's argument, no, I did not authorize it, and actually repeated it, they're going to have to say that's what that is. But that tells you just...
I mean, Comey's a good prosecutor himself, right? He's a lawyer.
Absolutely.
He knows what he's doing, right?
Absolutely. And now, the other piece, just getting to the merits, because this is more of a technical point, the reporting is this relates to somebody named Dan Richman, who is a friend of James Comey, a professor at Columbia University School of Law, and was also somebody who had a special employee position at the FBI when James Comey was the FBI director. And the reporting is that he has told to the Eastern District of Virginia prosecutors, the office that has the case, that he was not asked by James Comey to ever leak information or give information to the media when James Comey was the FBI director. If that is your star witness, having your star witness saying it's not true is they legally have to have something more.
So, Andrew, can we just zoom out a tiny bit? Because, you've talked about the utter frailties of this case and the weakness and feebleness in some cases of the case against Comey, where does it leave this whole debate about whether the Justice Department is being weaponised by a president? We've got a very different system in the UK where there is far less politics in the way kind of criminal cases are brought than in the US. Are we seeing a step change, something completely different that we've not seen before in America under the Trump presidency, or is this just a continuation of always a degree of politicisation in terms of maybe you go after your enemies or not?
We are seeing a complete change. And I have had to talk to a lot of people who have a cynical view about government, and they think, oh, don't they all do it? Isn't this just tit for tat? There was weaponization under Democrats, now there's weaponization under Republicans, and isn't that what's going on? So I have worked for Democratic and Republican administrations at the Department of Justice on including on very high-profile matters. Not a single time was there ever any interference from the White House, period, full stop. Including, I worked on the Enron case, a huge financial scandal that was under a Republican administration, and it would have been unheard of to have the White House call to say what should happen. And that is the norm post-Watergate, where Richard Nixon famously was trying to interfere and was trying to weaponize and have them do investigations, including tax investigations. It's like what happened under FBI Director Hoover, where you weaponize law enforcement. This is now out in the open. It makes what Nixon did look like child's play, where you have the President of the United States in a DM to the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, saying this is what you need to do, and you need to do it now because he was aware that the statute of limitations was running. That is complete weaponization and turning the Department of Justice into a loaded weapon that he is going to use is now using against his enemies.
Can I ask you one other question related to your former role? When you were working with Robert Mueller on the Russia investigation, which we know Trump absolutely hated, the report ended without having found conclusive evidence that Trump had colluded with Russia. But immediately, the headline became a totally different one. I think it was William Barr, the Attorney General at the time, came forward and said, this is vindication. There was no obstruction, there was no collusion. And that's the line that everyone remembers. How did that gap between what your report said and what we were told get so blurred so quickly?
And I'm going to add to that a little bit, because there were sort of two parts to the investigation. And one part should have been completely apolitical, which is, did Russia interfere in the election? And then the second part of the investigation was, and if so, did they have help from anybody in the Trump campaign? The first part of that has been proven over and over and over again, and not just by the Mueller team. There was also a bipartisan Senate report.
So we are absolutely safe to say, yes, Russia was involved in the 2016 election period.
And you could add, although this is now me saying you can add that for 2020 and 2024, and Europe knows that as well, looking at European elections. I mean, this is a strategy of using the internet and other means to interfere with democratic processes. So that was sort of step one, and that piece has also gotten blurred as, oh, the whole thing's a hoax.
Because they say Russia, meaning
right.
It's a Russia hoax.
Right, exactly. And the first part is, you would think that anybody in a bipartisan way would care about a democracy and care about whether it's Russia or any other foreign country. They don't have the right to vote in that democratic country's elections. The second part is absolutely true that we did not find sufficient evidence to say whether there was a conspiracy with anyone, including the current president, Donald Trump, in terms of a conspiracy with the Russians in doing this. One of the things that Bill Barr did, though, is created a gap. We had written our report and we had written summaries of our 2 volumes on the 2 pieces that we just talked about. And the thought was, well, of course, we've written the summary, so he would just release them. Yeah. And instead, he sat on them and released his own quote-unquote summary. I've written in a book about this, which is the summary. If you compare the summary to what we actually said, there's this huge gap. But there was about a 3-week period where the only news out there was what he said. And
so he never released what your findings were.
Ultimately, the report, the redacted report, came out, but at that point, the narrative was there. So, in many ways, someone could say it's a brilliant press strategy, but that is not the role of the Attorney General of the United States, who is the chief legal officer. You may not like the facts, you may disagree with them, but your obligation is to report them and then say why you disagree with it.
Can I just ask you this finally? Do you think the Justice Department snaps back to a more normal way of functioning? Or do you think that having seen what the president has got away with, it doesn't matter who comes next, they'll try to do the same?
I don't think that if you have what I'll say is a normal administration, whether led by a Republican or Democrat, that they're going to try to do the same. There are institutional norms that have governed for years. But to get to sort of the real import of your question is, if we could snap your fingers and we're in a new world where Donald Trump is not around, there will still be Trumpism. There still is. He has modeled behavior that has been successful. And so if you think about what we're seeing in the Republican-led Congress and the people who I believe in my heart know better, saying things that I just cannot believe that they think is true or even good for the country, they have seen that kind of behavior works. And so I think there will be a lot of sort of mini-me's, running around doing the same thing. And so that will be the challenge for, any sort of administration, again, Republican or Democratic, that is trying to reinstitute norms and facts and the rule of law.
Andrew Weissmann, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks.
Thank you
Pleasure.
very much indeed.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, JB Pritzker, the governor of Illinois, throwing down the gauntlet to Donald Trump, saying, if you want to arrest me, arrest me. And because Donald Trump has said, I don't know why, that JB Pritzker ought to be arrested and put in prison. He doesn't ever specify what the crime is, but maybe in Donald Trump's head now, and this is a serious point, it is a crime to oppose him, to challenge what Donald Trump is doing, to challenge whether there is executive overreach in terms of what the president's powers are, can be, and should be.
Yeah, you don't need to be a brain surgeon to work out the pattern that is emerging now, that when Donald Trump doesn't like a governor, be it Gavin Newsom of California or be it Pritzker of Illinois, he starts deploying federal troops onto the streets of that state. It is massive, militarised overreach of the presidential position to try and get even with someone who you think is your enemy. And so earlier this year, you'll remember, we saw troops on the streets of LA. We saw the justification to quell rioting. There was very little, I'm trying to think, any rioting before the troops arrived. But since then, we've seen troops on the streets of LA in California, seen troops on the streets of Washington, D.C., and now they are moving into two more areas. One is Portland, Oregon, again, a Democratic stronghold, and the other is Chicago, which has this very defiant, very powerful Democrat as its state governor. And Pritzker, like Newsom, have decided that actually you have to stand up to bullies. You have to take the fight back to Trump. And that's why you heard such a short phrase, come and get me. Come and get me means if you're going to put troops on my streets, you will have to deal with me because I am defending my state. And if you know anything at all about America, it's how much states value their own power. They value their independence. They value their sense of self-awareness and self-control. And Trump is overriding that now, and Pritzker's pushing back hard.
Yeah, and states' rights is such a fundamental part of the US Constitution. It is the United States of America, where the power is devolved to the 50 states, and there is some federal government activity. But if you looked at Donald Trump's justification and support for the overturning of the abortion rights of women, he said, well, I'm not saying women can't have an abortion. I'm just saying it's up to individual states to decide. States should have the power. Now he is trampling all over states' rights in this crackdown on illegal immigration. And when we talk about the militarization, I just want to give you one example. There was an apartment block on the south side of Chicago where the police wanted to raid it. They came via a Black Hawk helicopter, rappelled down like you are trying to root out terrorists. And they took away 37 people in zip ties,
Including
women,
children.
yeah, and the rest, where there were unmarked cars and trucks surrounding the building. This is a 5-story building that may have been housing a few illegal immigrants. Are you telling me we need Black Hawk helicopters and people parascending down to arrest the people inside it? That is militarization. And a kind of, on the streets of America, where no crime has been committed in terms of violence or whatever, it looked like dramatic overreach.
I think the trouble is that in reality, governors like Newsom and Pritzker have very few options available to them. I mean, this is an overreach by federal government into really dark areas of state self-determination. You've seen what Trump is doing, and I don't think it's too much of a leap to connect these two, but you've seen what he's trying to do in Texas, where he is essentially redistricting. In other words, trying to make it easier for Republicans to win by the gerrymandering of where voters, constituencies are. Gavin Newsom is responding to that by saying, if you do that in Texas, I'll do the same in California. And sure enough, you see Trump go for him in California. Here, you've got very few options. Pritzker has got very few options for how he fights Donald Trump's troops on the ground, particularly if, Trump manages to convince people that this is all about illegal immigration rather than kind of vitriol and personal vendetta. But I guess what unites both Pritzker and Newsom is they're just voicing it really loudly. It's a clarion call of warning to what's coming. And he's also done something which will really hit Trump where it hurts, which to invoke the spectacle of what he calls dementia-like behaviour.
Yeah, that will have offended Trump deeply, and that will kind of, polarise and lead to people taking more entrenched positions. But you were talking about Texas a minute ago and the whole redistricting argument, which we have covered on the News Agents USA. But Donald Trump is sending 200 Texan National Guardsmen to Chicago. If you think of America as this 50 states, where the governor of each state is like the prime minister of a country, and you're suddenly getting 200 Texans arriving probably 2,000 miles away in Chicago to take over policing.
Yeah.
And that sets up a stage where you could have police versus police, local police versus National Guardsmen over who has the rights. And you have got the local police that are answerable to the governor or to the mayor, because there's a lot of devolution of control over different police authorities, and whether it's the state patrol, the state troopers, or whoever it happens to be, or whether it's the local cops, you're going to have a situation where potentially You have police on police over what the ICE kind of private army
Yeah, the
are doing.
masked army,
The
yeah.
masked army are doing.
Yeah.
This is potentially explosive. And Pritzker is standing up to it. And Donald Trump thinks, I've got my base behind me. They want to deal with this stuff. They
Yeah.
want to deal with illegal immigration, deport them now. But, you know, Donald Trump said he was going after the really bad dudes, the drug runners and the people who were there kind of committing rape and murder and all the rest of it. And
Not the 6-year-old kids.
not the 6-year-old kids.
Yeah.
Not just
So
people.
what Pritzker's saying-
Well, not even the people who are just working on a building
Yeah.
site and
Or the
paying their
farms.
taxes,
Exactly.
or farms, or in serving in restaurants. But those are the people that are getting rounded up just as easily as the bad guys. And it's much easier to pick up the good legal people who are paying their taxes than it is the others.
He got elected, and I remember because I was in the hall at the Republican convention, he got elected on a promise of mass deportation,
Yeah.
which was not actually just about, criminals or illegals. It was about 15 million people. So, yeah, this is what it looks like, deport 50 million people. And what Pritzker said at a news conference earlier this week was, get out your phones, record this stuff. If you see it happening on your street corner, make sure you're filming them. Make sure you're trying to get names. Make sure you're trying to get identities. You know, he's actually going after this to try and stop it being anonymous. Now, I guess the question is, what happens, what happens when it is out there? What happens when it is filmed? Does that scare Trump? Does he back down? Or does it just create a sort of illusion, an impression of doing something to fight back? But you've raised this before. I think if you join up the dots, and many of the Democratic governors are starting to do that now, you get to a place in which Trump has managed to just rationalise and normalise this idea that there are troops on the streets, be it in California, be it in Oregon, be it in DC, be it in Illinois, all these democratic places, so that the closer you get to elections, the less able people feel to actually go about their voting democratic business without fear.
And then you drive down turnout in Democrat strongholds, and hey presto, you hold on to the House, you hold on to the Senate. The midterm elections don't need to be cancelled because you've done enough to kind of ensure that you win anyway.
Yeah, there's nothing like a soldier outside your polling booth, is
No,
there?
exactly. You can see the fracturing of the Bro coalition, which, as you say, Emily, was absolutely critical for Donald Trump, and the offence that is being felt at some of the messaging over the handling of immigration and the deporting of people who may just be working on a building site or a restaurant or in a field picking, crops, whatever it happens to be. And that this is not about just getting kind of really awful dudes out of America. It's getting a lot of innocent people out of America as well. And that there is a backlash. And you've seen it from Joe Rogan as well, when he said, these people being taken off to a Nicaraguan prison, and one of them may be a gay hairdresser. Is that really a crime? And I think that there is a sense in which that not only is the way Trump communicating it bad, but that the policy is bad as well. And people who kind of were all in for Donald Trump in November 2024 are now thinking, I'm not so sure.
Yeah, I mean, another guy, Aidan Ross, recently told his audience, I just don't think I'll ever care enough again for another politician. Now, these are not, these are not cuddly Democrats. These are not people who sit comfortably on the progressive left. These are people who, Ross himself has been repeatedly banned from platforms for, his language, pretty hateful slurs, all the rest of it. But he encouraged viewers to vote for Trump in 2024. He gifted Trump a Tesla Cybertruck and a Rolex watch. They were, as Americans say, all in. And now they're starting just to sow the seeds of, what the f*** have we done? Like, what did we do? And that sense that, electorates all over the world are having, which is, I gifted you my vote. I trusted you. And this is what you're doing with it. I don't think I'll ever go back to the ballot again.
What's so interesting as well is the way government departments in the US are communicating like activists rather than... I mean, I don't know whether you ever go on the Department of Homeland Security Twitter feed, but it has just become MAGA-land. I mean, their pinned tweet said, America's been invaded by criminals and predators. We need you to get them out. So a picture of Uncle Sam, with the finger pointing. We need you to get them out. And every day there is a ton of this. It used to be the stuff of Homeland Security that there's a high consensus of security. Boring stuff about public information stuff. It is now full-on weaponized MAGA-land stuff that is just, if Donald Trump clicks on it, he's going to be happy, and it's been sort of designed to make him happy.
Yeah. I guess the question is whether any of the influencers change the strategy, or whether Donald Trump just cuts them loose and says, yeah, I got what I needed from you. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Well, bye-bye from us. We'll be back next week. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.
See you then. Bye.
The Newsagents USA.